They say death is the end, but what if it's only the first veil falling? For decades, confidential archives from the former Soviet Union held a report that was never meant to see the light of day, not for lack of evidence, but because it revealed something science doesn't dare confront and religion tries to keep under control. A general, clinically dead for 9 days, returned. And what he described goes against everything you've ever heard about reality, time, and the human soul. We're not talking about symbolic visions or spiritual metaphors. We're talking about conversations with entities that knew impossible things, about a consciousness that remained active even when the brain had completely collapsed, and about messages written by hands guided by something that wasn't human. Why was this account kept secret for so long? And why is it now beginning to gain attention in quiet circles of scholars and retired military officers? What will be revealed in this video is not a theory. It's a testimony, disturbing, unsettling, and yet impossible to ignore. In what follows, you'll understand why you've never heard about this, and how this secret might change everything. What happens in the exact moment when the heart stops? To medicine, it's the end point, the shutdown of the machine, the collapse of systems. But Yevgeny Livensov, a Soviet general used to logic and rigor, discovered something different. When his heart stopped, the silence that followed wasn't an absence. It was a presence. A dense, living, conscious presence. As if he had been pulled out of the timeline and placed in a space where nothing aged, but everything new. He described that moment as floating between two worlds, the one we know and the one we pretend doesn't exist. No pain, no voice, no human thought, just the sharp sensation of being and of being watched. It wasn't a tunnel, nor a light. It was something subtler, more ancient, a kind of awareness that didn't need a body or language. But if there was so much silence, why did he feel that someone, or something, was there with him? The most disturbing part was that this emptiness wasn't empty. There was an invisible pulse, almost imperceptible, as if the universe was breathing behind matter, and Livensov knew, without anyone telling him, that this was just the beginning, because time in that place didn't move. It simply ceased to exist. And if time disappears, what else disappears with it? Memories, regrets, or the very idea of identity? Science calls this a threshold experience, a brief collapse of consciousness before total death. But the sensors showed a complete absence of brain activity. No electric pulse, no reaction. And yet, he saw, he heard, he understood. What truly keeps us alive? The body, or something the body merely hosts for a time? How many secrets can fit between two heartbeats that never complete? When Livensov came back, the room's clock showed 9 days had passed. But to him, not even an hour had gone by. What happened in that gap, between clinical death and return, defies any medical explanation. And if it wasn't a delusion, then where was he? Or stranger still, in what state of consciousness was he held? Some would call it delirium, others, a mystical experience. But the general was not a mystic, nor inclined toward spiritual interpretations. And yet, he returned convinced of one thing. The moment between life and death is not an end. It's a crossing point. But a crossing to where? And why can only a few remember what they saw when they passed through that threshold? When doctors examined Livensov's scans, the diagnosis was unanimous. Brain activity was virtually non-existent. No sign of electrical response, no neurological reflex. By scientific standards, he should not have been conscious. And yet, he remembered everything. Conversations, settings, sensations, thoughts that should not have existed, because the engine of the mind was turned off. How is it possible to think without an active brain? Neuroscience teaches us that consciousness is a product of the mind, a kind of electric symphony of neurons in action. But what Liventsov experienced challenges that premise. He described complex dialogues, deep reflections, insights that seemed to come from a source far beyond himself. There was no body, yet there was clarity. No eyes, yet there was vision. Could consciousness be operating in a field science has yet to measure? That hypothesis, while uncomfortable, is not new. Philosophers like Plotinus and scientists like Karl Pribram have suggested the mind may be like a radio. The brain only tunes into a frequency, but it's not the source of the broadcast. If that's true, then what we call brain death might only be the loss of the receiver, not the signal. And if that's the case, how many thoughts continue to exist when we believe everything has stopped? Liventsov said that in this state, time was perceived differently, as if past, present, and future were just variations of the same substance. He knew things that hadn't happened yet. He felt he wasn't alone, not like someone was watching him, but as if reality itself surrounded him, like a conscious field. Could this be the universal mind so many spiritual texts speak of, and that science avoids naming? In his account, there was one phrase that never left his memory. The body sleeps, but the mind awakens to what it has always been. Who said it? He doesn't know. But the certainty with which he heard that voice, even without ears, marked him deeply. Could consciousness be something that has always been there, waiting for the body to finally go quiet so it can speak? But if the mind continues without the brain, what else continues? Emotions? Desires? Guilt? What happens to what we carry inside when the body can no longer hide it? During the days his body remained motionless, Liventsov had an experience that defies any known logic. He claims to have spoken with an entity that was not human. It had no face, no voice in the conventional sense, but its presence was impossible to ignore. It knew everything, including the exact moment he would wake up. There were no questions, only answers, as if it already knew every doubt that would arise before they even surfaced. This entity didn't speak in words. The communication was direct, almost telepathic, a kind of understanding that didn't need language, as if truth was transferred in its entirety, without noise or interpretation. And the most disturbing part, it seemed to know Liventsov better than he knew himself. It remembered things he had forgotten. It commented on feelings he had never dared admit. Who or what can access the innermost essence of a human being? Science might call this a construction of the subconscious, a way for the brain to cope with extreme trauma. But that explanation stumbles over details that don't quite fit. Liventsov reported information that was only confirmed after his recovery. Details about the room where he was hospitalized, phrases spoken by doctors during moments when he, theoretically, wasn't even there. How do you explain knowledge that came before the physical experience? According to him, this entity didn't judge. It simply showed. It presented scenarios, possibilities, choices made, and consequences not yet understood. It was like a mirror, but a mirror that reflected the soul, not the image. You're not ready to remember everything, the presence said. But when you return, you'll start to see the signs. That phrase burned itself into Liventsov's consciousness, as if it marked the beginning of a mission he didn't yet understand. What impressed him most wasn't the content of the encounter, but the feeling it provoked, a mix of reverence, awe, and a strange sense of belonging. That intelligence, so different from the human mind, seemed part of something greater, as if it were only a spark from a whole that's impossible to imagine. Could he have been in the presence of a fragment of the very source of existence? But if this entity knew the exact moment of his return, then death is not an accident. It's an appointment. And who sets that meeting? Why exactly 9 days? That question tormented Liventsov from the moment he woke up. It wasn't 8, nor 10. It was exactly 9 days. a number that, at first glance, shouldn't have any particular significance. But in searching for answers, he discovered something unsettling. Ancient Slavic, Hindu, and even Greek cultures spoke of the ninth day as a point of spiritual transition, a moment when the soul either fully detaches or returns, transformed. How could an atheist military man, unfamiliar with that symbolism, have lived through something so aligned with millennia-old traditions? In Russia, there is an ancestral custom of offering prayers 9 days after someone dies. It's not just a ritual. It's believed that, up to that point, the soul still wanders, aware of what it left behind. Monks speak of a process of spiritual decision during that time. But Liventsov had never heard of any of this. He grew up under the Soviet regime, where faith was seen as superstition, and rituals like these were erased from collective memory. So why did his coma last exactly the amount of time needed to complete this invisible stage? During those 9 days, he felt that something was being adjusted. It wasn't suffering, nor peace. It was a kind of waiting, as if he were being evaluated, but not by an external entity. It was his own consciousness reviewing choices, facing reflections he didn't know he carried. And each time a thought faded, a new layer emerged, as if there were internal steps that could only be seen when the world's time stopped existing. Science sees coma as a state of inactivity, a shutdown. But for Liventsov, it was exactly the opposite. He claims that during those days he had the clearest thoughts of his life, as if, free from the weight of the body and the noise of the ego, his mind had been fully activated, a serene clarity, yet relentless. "Everything I ran from came to me," he wrote, and added, "There was no way to lie where I was." The number 9 appears in such distinct traditions that it would be careless to ignore its recurrence. In ancient Egypt, the Ennead was the group of 9 creator gods. In Christianity, there are 9 choirs of angels. In the East, 9 is the number of spiritual enlightenment. Why did so many cultures arrive at the same number as a symbol of transition? And even more, what happens on the 10th day, which is never mentioned? What if the 9 days are a kind of cosmic threshold? A silent countdown that defines the destiny of consciousness before something final happens? When Liventsov finally opened his eyes, he didn't say a word, but his hand, still weak and trembling, began to move on its own. The doctors thought it was a spasm, but soon realized the marks were forming letters, then sentences, then entire pages. He wrote with speed and precision, but without thinking, as if he were merely obeying an invisible force. "It's not me," he said, in one of the few times he spoke during those first days. "I'm just being used." The words that appeared on paper didn't come from his rational mind. They were complex thoughts, symbolic messages, reflections that went beyond his usual vocabulary. Some were in languages he had never studied. At certain moments, he seemed to write in codes or symbols that were later identified as ancient variants of Aramaic and liturgical Church Slavonic. How could this be explained in a man who had never had contact with sacred or esoteric texts? This automatic writing, or psychography as some would call it, is recorded in various cultures throughout history. From 19th century mediums to Siberian shamans, there are reports of bodies that become temporary instruments of something greater. But Liventsov's case was different. He didn't summon anything, didn't prepare, didn't enter a trance. He simply woke up, and the writing began, as if a channel had been opened without his permission. Among the texts written in those first days were warnings, short, direct phrases like, "They are not ready, the separation has already begun," or "Those who forget who they are will be forgotten." There were also unanswered questions. How many souls must fade so that one may awaken? And who will guard the silence when the sky speaks? Words that sounded like fragments of something larger, a message interrupted in time. When specialists were called to analyze the texts, many refused to continue after the initial reading. Some said they felt chills, others had intense nightmares. One, a retired linguistics professor, said, "This wasn't written to be understood. It was written to activate something." But activate what? An ancestral memory, a spiritual calling, a code meant only for those who survived the impossible? If those words weren't his, then whose were they? And why choose a Soviet general, someone who dismissed spirituality, to transmit them to the world? The first phrases written by Liventsov seemed like delusions, but as the texts accumulated, they formed a pattern, not of madness, but of structure. There was logic, a dark coherence, as if they spoke of something inevitable. The fate of humanity will be decided in silence. Prepare for the crossing that will not be announced. The doctors labeled it post-traumatic reflexes. But some of the scientists present knew this wasn't simply the product of a recovering brain. What frightened them wasn't the content, it was the tone. There was no attempt to convince, nor any kind of associated belief. The messages were cold, objective, impersonal, and all ended with the same warning. What is required is not faith, but preparation. That phrase was what unsettled the observers, because faith is passive. Preparation implies urgency. It implies that something is coming. But what? And why would Liventsov have access to it? Several neurologists invited to analyze the writings refused to continue after the first few days. One of them said in private, "If this is true, we're dealing with something beyond our field of study." Another, more skeptical, tried to explain it as a form of residual consciousness. But how to justify content that predicted events, small but precise, that only happened days after the writing? The messages spoke of a collective awakening that would soon begin. They referred to a separation of consciousnesses, a process where each human being would be confronted with what they had refused to see in life. None of this was part of Liventsov's vocabulary before the coma. Friends and colleagues described him as rational, pragmatic, even cynical. But now he wrote like a tired prophet, like someone who had seen a truth too heavy to carry alone. When asked about the meaning of those messages, he only replied, "They're not mine. They just passed through me." And even when he tried not to write, his hand trembled, restless, as if something inside him demanded to continue. How do you explain that without stepping into the realm of the unexplainable? How do you ignore that behind the words there was an intelligence, watching? But if no one wanted to listen, if everyone turned their faces away, then what exactly were these messages threatening to reveal? And what will happen when there's no more time left to ignore them? Not all consciousnesses survive what comes after death. That was one of the harshest revelations left in Liventsov's writings. He reported witnessing states of existence where some souls remained whole, lucid, at peace, while others simply dissolved like dust blown by a silent wind. There was no punishment, no scream, just the slow extinction of something that once was someone. As if the soul, without internal structure, couldn't sustain its own continuity. This account didn't come with definitive explanations, but it suggested that there is a fundamental difference between living and being conscious of oneself. According to Liventsov, the souls that survived carried a certain glow, not physical, but perceptible, the result of choices made in life. He didn't speak of morality or religion. He spoke of clarity, of people who dared to question themselves, who faced their own darkness without running away. Those souls didn't disappear. They became even more aware of what they were. And the others? They were fragments, remnants of consciousness that didn't know they had passed on. Some trapped in cycles of repetitive thought, others plunged into disorientation, and some simply faded. They weren't judged, he wrote. They just didn't know how to continue. as if the continuation of existence were an internal effort, a vibration of the soul that needs to be maintained. But maintained how? With what kind of energy? With what memory? It's a disconcerting idea. What if dying isn't enough to move on? What if there is a kind of death after death, a deeper disappearance where not even the memory of self remains? Science doesn't comment on this. Philosophy suggests it, spirituality hints at it, but Livantsov stated it clearly. Some cross over, others fade away. The question that remains isn't about what exists afterward, but about who will have the structure to keep existing. This raises an uncomfortable doubt. What determines that permanence? Is it not what we did, but what we became? Could the soul be like a flame? Some strengthened by life experiences, others smothered by denial of the self? And more than that, what if that decision isn't made at the moment of death, but much earlier, perhaps even before we're born? If some souls disappear, then who guarantees that yours will continue? And who or what draws that invisible line between being and forgetting? Livantsov described a passage that resembled neither heaven nor hell. It was a mental space, but at the same time real, as if each soul created its own reality, shaped by everything it had carried in life. Some found immediate peace, as if returning to a forgotten home. Others, however, entered deep states of suffering. But it wasn't a punishment imposed. It was something that came from within, as if they were trapped in a reflection of what they truly were. There were no judging entities, no scales, no golden gates. There was only a silent, impersonal, yet infinitely conscious force. It didn't say what was right or wrong. It simply made the soul see everything, with a clarity no one could endure while alive. Every choice, every omission, every word spoken or left unsaid. And what hurt wasn't judgment. It was the raw truth, the impossibility of lying to oneself. Who can bear that kind of revelation? For some, that inner confrontation was purifying, an almost alchemical process where the soul seemed to burn through its illusions, shedding its heaviest layers until emerging free. For others, it was unbearable. And in those cases, according to Livantsov, consciousness entered a kind of loop, reliving the same pains, the same mistakes, until it could see what needed to be seen, not as punishment, but as a natural consequence. The pain didn't come from outside. It came from what had been hidden. That concept echoes in Eastern spiritual traditions, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in ancient Gnostic texts. But Livantsov knew none of them. What he experienced came without filters, without influence, as a raw, direct encounter. It's not a courtroom, he wrote. It's a mirror that sees you as you've never seen yourself. And in that mirror, what emerged wasn't a face, but an essence, what was left after all masks had fallen. The most intriguing thing is that he never used words like heaven or hell. He simply said, there are states, and there are choices. There was no eternal punishment, but there were consequences that seemed to last until something inside the soul finally gave in. The suffering wasn't imposed by a deity, but emerged as the natural effect of a soul that had strayed too far from itself for too long. As if, in that state, everything superficial simply stopped working. But if there is no external judgment, then are we all being judged now by ourselves? And what are we building inside? A refuge or an invisible prison, waiting for the day? Everything is finally seen? Livantsov's body, devastated by what doctors called an irreversible stroke, returned to full functionality within a few days. What should have left permanent damage, paralysis, loss of speech, cognitive deficits, vanished without explanation. Scans showed previously necrotic tissue now healthy. No experimental therapy, no unusual medication. Just the baffled silence of the specialists and a man who claimed to have returned from a place he couldn't name. A neurologist even privately stated, I've never seen anything like it in 40 years of practice. Either medicine doesn't know everything, or there's something we're ignoring. Others took the safer route. They attributed the recovery to a rare phenomenon, a statistically possible but highly unlikely event. But how to explain that? Beyond the healing, Liventsov came back with information he shouldn't have had. He recounted conversations held at his bedside, described the exact moment a nurse turned off the monitoring machine, days before his return. Modern science, built on data and repeatability, hesitates in the face of what it cannot measure. But what happens when the data defies logic? When a dead brain returns to function and comes back different? Not just recovered, but expanded with a lucidity and sensitivity that had never been there before. Could there be a field of consciousness operating outside the physical body? A field that, under certain conditions, is capable of reversing even what we call death. Liventsov said that the body was rebuilt from within. Not by him, but by something that repositioned him at the right time. It wasn't a religious sensation, nor a vision of a miracle. It was a raw realization. There are life mechanisms that operate beyond biology. And perhaps, just perhaps, these mechanisms are available to those who tune into something greater than the ego. But how do you access that? And why does it happen to some and not others? The most unsettling thing was the doctor's gaze. They avoided questions, avoided prolonged contact. They seemed uncomfortable with Liventsov's presence, as if something in him now exceeded what they were prepared to handle. He wasn't trying to convince anyone. He simply said, "I saw what we are when we no longer have the body to lie." And that, for many, was too much information. But if even science, when faced with certain events, chooses silence, what else has it seen but decided not to say? And what would happen if this kind of experience were more common than we imagine, just poorly documented or deliberately forgotten? Upon recovering, Liventsov didn't just return with strange accounts. He returned with the certainty that what he had seen wasn't new. It was ancient, deeply known by civilizations that lived long before ours, but whose knowledge was erased, distorted, discredited. They hide it because they fear what they cannot control, he wrote. He believed that religions, governments, and scientific institutions knew, not everything, but enough to keep the rest quiet. And behind that silence was fear. In his words, death is not a mystery, it's restricted knowledge. And that knowledge has, over the centuries, been diluted into dogma, reduced to metaphor, hidden behind ceremonies that lost their original meaning. The ancients knew that consciousness doesn't end with the body. They knew about the 9 days. They knew about purification. They knew about the place where souls prepare before returning. But something happened, a rupture, a forced forgetting, and everything came to be treated as superstition. Liventsov didn't blame religions. He blamed their political use. According to him, the truth about death wasn't hidden because it was dangerous, but because it was liberating. And a conscious soul doesn't bow easily. It doesn't accept half-living. It cannot be manipulated with promises of heaven or threats of hell. True knowledge doesn't imprison you. It frees you. And that's exactly what scares those who thrive on control. The messages, he wrote, made veiled references to destroyed libraries, redacted passages in sacred scriptures, symbols erased from ancient monuments. They were clues, not statements. But all pointed to the same idea. What we call life after death was treated by ancient civilizations as a natural part of existence. Not a mystery, not a dogma, but a cycle. A cycle that was interrupted by the spiritual amnesia imposed on us. Is that an exaggeration? Maybe. But then why did so many cultures, so distant from one another, speak of the same transitions, the same stages, the same sensations after death? Why were those parallels dismissed by academia? Why are near-death experiences still treated with disdain, even though thousands of people around the world report them? The silence in this case seems more like a choice than a lack of evidence, and what if this knowledge is still hidden, kept in places no one visits, or disguised in texts we read without really seeing? And what if, behind everything we've been taught, there's a code, waiting for someone with eyes to see? Among the images Liventsov carried from the other side, one in particular haunted him. He saw a space, not physical but real, where millions of consciousnesses floated, suspended. Some calm, as if simply waiting. Others confused, trapped in fragmented thoughts. And there were those in absolute despair, as if they knew they wouldn't be able to leave. There were no walls, no sky, no ground. Just a gray field of presence. And waiting. Waiting for what? He described this place as a between time, a region where souls who don't know who they are or where they're going remain indefinitely. Not as punishment, but out of uncertainty. These were consciousnesses that in life never questioned reality, never sought meaning, only repeated habits, beliefs, fears. And now, without the body, they stood naked before themselves, with no reference, no direction. Just there, feeling everything. This kind of vision appears in multiple traditions under different names. The Tibetans call it the Bardo. The Egyptians spoke of the Duat. In Gnostic texts, it's the field of shadows. But Liventsov had never read about any of this. And even so, he described with precision symbols that were later found in engravings from ancient cultures. There were patterns, energy flows, mental structures floating as if they were maps, to a place no one remembers how to reach. In one of the passages he wrote after waking up, he said, "We are surrounded by presences that don't know they've left." It wasn't a metaphor, it was a statement, and he added, "Some of those souls touch our world, trying to understand what happened, trying to be remembered." Could that explain certain phenomena we call paranormal? Voices with no origin, feelings of being watched, dreams that don't seem to be ours? The most unsettling part was the way he described the risk. If you live on autopilot, you die on autopilot. And those who die that way don't know they're dead. That line echoed among the few who had access to his full accounts. What if the greatest danger in life isn't death, but the absence of awareness in the moment it arrives? How? Many souls, then, might be in that invisible limbo, not by deserving it, but by forgetting themselves. But if that space exists, and if it's that close to us, who says we're alone right now? And who, or what, can help a lost soul remember who it is? Hindus in India, indigenous Amazonians, surgical survivors in the United States, and Russian soldiers, all at some point claim to have seen the same thing. A welcoming light, a eyes, sensation of absolute peace, the loss of the sense of time, and the impression of returning from somewhere. How can such similar accounts come from people who never met, who were born in different cultures and eras? Coincidence? Or could it be the echo of something we all forget until we're forcibly reminded? When Liventsov learned that thousands of people around the world had already experienced what he thought was unique, he was shocked. It was as if there were a hidden code that only reveals itself when consciousness separates from the body. An invisible script written by something greater than any belief or doctrine. He said this pattern was so ancient it predated all religions, and so universal that it didn't need translation. It was felt, pure, direct, undeniable. But what disturbed him most was science's resistance to acknowledging this pattern. Doctors called it hallucinations, the brain's dying discharges. But how can a collapsing mind produce such coherent accounts? And why do people from such different backgrounds, skeptics, believers, children, describe the same elements? The feeling of weightlessness, the life review, the presence of an invisible intelligence. Why is there so much fear in accepting that there might be something real behind it? Liventsov believed the pattern was a signature, a reminder delivered, to us at that critical moment. A sign that consciousness doesn't end, it simply shifts frequency. And maybe, just maybe, if that code were understood while still alive, everything would change. Because those who understand death understand life, and perhaps, just perhaps, we're here precisely to decipher that riddle before the crossing. In one of his messages, he wrote, "The light doesn't come to get you. It shows you who you are. And if that's true, then the whole near-death experience isn't an invitation to escape reality, but an urgent call to wake up inside it. And those who hear it come back different, with eyes that see more, with a soul that no longer settles for simple answers. But if there's a code, who wrote it? And why are so many people led to it? But almost no one remembers what it really means." Even after returning, Levinsoff reported a constant sensation of being watched. Not in an oppressive way, but intensely. As if something, or someone, remained connected to him, watching every thought, every silence. It wasn't paranoia. It was presence. An intelligence that didn't need to manifest to be felt. "It's as if I left the door open, and on the other side, someone is waiting for me," he wrote. But who waits for someone who already came back? That feeling didn't fade over time. On the contrary, it became clearer as he began to speak openly about what he had experienced. Whenever he revealed something important, he felt a kind of invisible pressure, a mental discomfort, as if he were touching something he shouldn't. And sometimes, right after writing a more revealing message, it simply disappeared from the pages. Pages went missing, words he swore he had written were no longer there. Hallucination or silent interference? Levinsoff began to suspect that others knew, that what he experienced wasn't rare, just rarely revealed, and that perhaps there was an unofficial order, invisible to ordinary eyes, that monitored these cases and prevented them from being widely disclosed. Not out of malice, but out of fear of the collapse of social and philosophical structures. Because if death is not the end, then everything we were taught about power, fear, and control loses meaning. In moments of deep silence, he said he noticed signs, improbable coincidences, encounters with strangers who seemed to know too much, dreams with clear messages, all as if a communication was ongoing, but on another frequency. As if the connection with the invisible continued, even with the body awake. And this led him to believe in a disturbing idea. What if returning to life is not an ending, but the beginning of a second mission? The presence he felt wasn't threatening, but it demanded attention, discipline, integrity, as if an invisible responsibility had been placed on his shoulders. He didn't see himself as chosen, nor as special, but something inside told him that those who cross the threshold and return don't come back by chance. There is something to be said, something to be done, and those who fail to fulfill that task feel the weight of their own omission. But what if that same presence is around others, many others, who haven't yet realized it? What if every person who approaches this kind of knowledge is, in some way, being touched, observed, and perhaps prepared? Levinsoff knew he would be discredited. It didn't matter what he had experienced, nor how many pages he had written. Science would demand proof, measurements, graphs. Religion would demand dogmas, sacred names, alignment. But what he brought back didn't fit into any of those molds. It was raw, confusing, often uncomfortable, and for that very reason, real. The truth, he said, rarely comes wrapped to please. It tears, it dismantles, it disorients. Because it wasn't made to comfort, but to awaken. Skepticism followed him like a shadow. Some military colleagues mocked him. Others whispered he was crazy. Doctors preferred to ignore the accounts, and even those few who showed interest backed away once they realized they were dealing with something they couldn't explain or control. And yet, Levinsoff persisted, not to convince, but because to stay silent would be to betray his own soul. "Speaking is harder than silence," he wrote, "but silence is dying again." This conflict between reason and experience is not new. Pascal said, "The heart has its reasons which reason knows nothing of." William James, the father of modern psychology, claimed that mystical experiences, though subjective, carry a transformative authority. And yet, the line between madness and revelation is still drawn by standards that exclude inner truth. But who decides what's real? Those who measure or those who live it? Levensoff had no intention of creating a new doctrine. He wasn't seeking followers. His only goal was to report what he saw, what he felt, what transformed him. And even so, he was met with resistance, because there is something deeply threatening about someone who returns from death and refuses to bow to accepted explanations, who says, "I don't know what it was, but I know it was real." Against that kind of statement, there is no argument, only discomfort. The war between skepticism and deep experience is, at its core, a battle for the control of reality. Who has the right to say what exists? Those who haven't lived it, or those who can't forget what they've lived? Perhaps that's why so many accounts like Levensoff's end up lost, ignored, discredited. Not because they lack evidence, but because people lack the courage to accept that some truths don't fit into words or formulas. And what if those truths are being silenced not by accident, but because they reveal something that can no longer be controlled once it's out? How many other voices have returned and chosen silence, fearing the weight of a truth that can only be spoken by someone who has already died once? In the end, Levensoff understood that his story wasn't just his. Every memory, every vision, every word written seemed to have been placed there for someone else, perhaps for you. Because, according to him, no one passes through this life without a mission, and no death happens without a destination. There is no such thing as coincidence when it comes to the soul. There is a purpose watching us, even when we pretend not to see. And that purpose doesn't begin with death. It begins long before. He said there were signs, small, almost imperceptible. Sensations we ignore, dreams we forget upon waking, coincidences we call random. But all those fragments, according to him, were like pieces of a warning, as if we were being slowly prepared without knowing it, to remember, to recognize, to accept that the reality we live in is not all that exists, and that the other reality is much closer than we imagine. In one of his last writings, Levensoff wrote, "You don't need to believe, you just need to feel what you already know." That phrase, seemingly simple, echoes like a whisper straight to the soul. Because what if, deep down, we already know what we came here to do? What if the fear of death is only a reflection of the fear of failing at what we committed to before we were born? Who decides when we're ready? And could that decision already have been made by you on another plane? He didn't speak with arrogance, nor like an enlightened one. He spoke as someone who had seen too much and carried that weight in his eyes. His mission, according to him, wasn't to convince the world. It was to plant doubts, the right doubts, the ones that don't let us sleep peacefully, but force us to wake up. Because waking up hurts, yes, but living asleep is dying every day. And perhaps the greatest secret he brought back was this: the crossing begins in life. Maybe you've felt it too. A discomfort you can't explain, a search that has no name, an unease with ready-made answers. It's not coincidence, it's movement, something inside you being activated by truths that had been asleep. Not by Levensoff's story, but by what it stirs in you, by what it reignites without asking permission. And what if the same being that spoke to him is also looking at you right now, just waiting for you to remember what, on some level, you never forgot?